Her uncle's voice, choked with grief, echoes the unbearable truth.
Most difficult time. It has been more than 4 months since Vanessa was tragically taken from us. Not a day goes by that we don't reflect on the enormity of our loss. Vanessa possessed special gifts. She was a loving, caring, and intelligent young woman who had her whole life ahead of her. In her brief 27 years, she had already achieved much, but we know she had much more to do.
This is the haunting reality of Vanessa Marcotte's story, a vibrant 27-year-old Google employee whose bright future vanished on a seemingly ordinary afternoon in 2016. Vanessa had everything going for her: a promising career, a loving family, and a future full of untapped potential. She was the kind of person who had the world at her feet, always giving her best at work and sharing an infectious smile with everyone she met. But one fateful day, she stepped out for a jog, something she had done countless times before, and that small decision led to the loss of a life and the devastation of a family. Princeton, a town that hadn't seen a violent crime in decades, was about to be gripped by a nightmare no one could have predicted. In a community where everyone knew everyone, the disappearance of a young woman on such a peaceful afternoon would shatter the illusion of safety. What should have been just another quiet Sunday soon became the beginning of a mystery no one could solve. Vanessa's family, friends, and the people who knew her best had no way of knowing that by the time nightfall came, their lives would be forever changed. The shock of what was happening around them was far beyond their comprehension. One moment, Vanessa was jogging peacefully, and the next, she was gone, swallowed by the vast silence of the woods. If stories of unsettling mysteries and the pursuit of justice captivate you, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to join us on this journey. Vanessa's story is just the beginning. Stay with us, because the truth of what happened to her will shock you, and we're only getting started. For Vanessa, a jog on a sunny afternoon was nothing out of the ordinary. She had done it countless times before, each time feeling the rush of the cool air, the rhythm of her steps carrying her through the quiet streets of Princeton. It was her escape, her time to clear her mind, and nothing ever seemed out of place. That Sunday, August 7th, 2016, was supposed to be no different. Vanessa left her mother's house around 1 p.m., dressed in her workout gear, headphones around her neck, and phone in hand. She wasn't planning to go far, a simple, familiar route through a nearby forest path, a few miles at most. The kind of path that people took for granted, peaceful and serene, far removed from the noise of the world. But little did anyone know, this seemingly ordinary route would soon be the setting for an unimaginable tragedy. A witness saw Vanessa briefly around 1 p.m. at the convenience store, standing outside and appearing to look for water. Nothing strange about it, just a woman stopping on a run, probably thirsty, maybe just enjoying the calm of a lazy Sunday. She was still in her sportswear, her phone in hand, her headphones hanging loosely around her neck. That was the last anyone saw of her. Then, around 2:11 p.m., something happened. The phone that had been used just an hour before check-in with the world fell silent. Vanessa's phone lost signal. Just like that, the connection to the outside world was severed. Her phone would never ring again. It wasn't until several hours later, when her mother grew increasingly anxious and called the police, that anyone realized something was seriously wrong. But long before that, the woods had already begun to hold their secrets. What no one had heard, what no one had seen, was the dark-colored SUV that had been spotted earlier in the day. It was parked near the entrance to the woods, its hood open. A man was standing next to it, his eyes hidden behind the reflection of his sunglasses, his attention seemingly diverted. He was on his phone, talking or texting. No one could say for sure. He was there when Vanessa disappeared, and when a witness had glanced back an hour later, the car remained, but the man was gone. No one had heard any screaming, no cries for help, just the eerie silence of the woods, as though everything was perfectly normal. But in that silence, something had changed. What should have been a routine jog had turned into an unsettling mystery. No one knew what had happened, where Vanessa had gone, or why she had suddenly disappeared. Her last known location was in front of that store, minutes away from the forest, but now she was gone. Just like that. As time passed, Rosanna's worst fear began to take shape. Her daughter was missing, and no one knew why. No one knew who could be responsible, and no one knew where to start. The silence of the woods, the absence of answers, was about to send this case spiraling into a darkness that no one was prepared for. As the hours ticked by, the unsettling silence only grew. Rosanna, Vanessa's mother, felt her unease transform into something deeper, something more desperate. By 5 p.m., with no word from her daughter, no call, no message, she knew something was terribly wrong. It wasn't like Vanessa to disappear without a trace. The familiar pattern of their communication, the small check-ins throughout the day, had abruptly stopped. Rosanna's gut told her what her mind was refusing to believe. Her daughter wasn't just lost. Something had happened. Without hesitation, Rosanna made the call. She dialed the police, her voice trembling with the weight of her words. Her daughter, who had left for a simple jog just hours ago, had not come home. The officers, sensing the urgency in her tone, began their response, but no one could have imagined the nightmare they were about to unravel. The search began quickly, with local police, volunteers, and even search dogs fanning out through the woods. They combed the forest paths where Vanessa was known to run, their flashlights piercing through the dense underbrush. The air was thick with the palpable sense of dread that had begun to settle over the town. This was no longer a missing persons case. It had become something far darker. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the urgency only intensified. The search team pressed on, calling Vanessa's name, searching every inch of the area. But with each passing minute, as the light faded, the hope of finding her alive seemed to slip further and further away. The woods, once so peaceful and familiar, now felt ominous, like they were hiding the truth that everyone desperately sought. And still, there was no sign of Vanessa, no footprints, no trace, no clue as to where she had gone. The search lasted for hours, each moment more heartbreaking than the last. But as the night wore on, something happened. A shift in the air, an unsettling discovery in the midst of the gloom. Less than a mile from the main road, hidden in the dense brush, something was found. A body, motionless, lying in the grass. The flashlights flickered over the scene, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The air, thick with the weight of anticipation, seemed to stand still as the searchers closed in. The relief of finding something, anything, quickly turned to horror as the truth became undeniable. It was Vanessa. The quiet, peaceful woods, the place she had known so well, were now the backdrop of a tragedy that would forever haunt this community. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She was supposed to come home, to return to her family, to continue the life she had started. But now, all that was left was a lifeless body, and the beginning of an investigation that would leave everyone questioning how something so horrible could have happened in their quiet town. The investigators arrived at the scene, their expressions grim as they surveyed the area. The details were chilling. Vanessa's body had been discarded in a place far removed from the safety of her familiar route. Her clothes were missing, and there were signs of violent struggle. Burn marks marred her hands and feet, light scorch marks that spoke of an attempt to destroy evidence. Her shoes, abandoned just a few feet away, were scorched as if someone had intentionally set fire to them. The darkness of the woods now seemed to reflect the horror of what had been done. But what was even more unsettling was the silence surrounding the discovery. No obvious signs of struggle, no blood, no footprints, just the eerie absence of sound. It was as though Vanessa had been taken, hidden away, and left to die in the shadows of the trees, far from the eyes of the world. The lack of physical evidence left the investigators in a disorienting state of confusion. What had happened in the hours between Vanessa's disappearance and the discovery of her body? No one could say for sure. But one thing was clear. This wasn't a random act. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure Vanessa's death was a secret. But there was no way to hide the truth forever. The search for answers had just begun, and with it, the race against time to uncover the identity of the person who had shattered this small town's sense of safety. And in the darkness of the night, with the first glimmers of dawn just beginning to break, the investigation would take a turn, a discovery that would change everything. The discovery of Vanessa's body sent shockwaves through the small town of Princeton, but it was just the beginning of a long and arduous investigation. The investigators, now fully aware that this was no simple case, began to piece together the fragments of what had happened in those missing hours between Vanessa's last known moment and the grim discovery in the woods. But with each new piece of information, the mystery seemed to grow only more complicated. Forensic teams worked tirelessly, examining every inch of the scene, collecting evidence, and trying to uncover what had led to such a senseless, brutal act. The cause of death was quickly confirmed: strangulation. But it was the other signs on her body that told the true story of her final moments. There were defensive wounds on Vanessa's hands, small cuts and bruises that suggested she had fought for her life. Her hands had been raised, possibly in an attempt to shield herself from the attacker, and her nails, torn and broken, had left behind biological evidence that would soon prove to be crucial. It wasn't just the marks of a victim. It was the unmistakable evidence of a woman who had fought back with everything she had. But as the investigation progressed, the frustration set in. There were no signs of forced entry, no direct witness, and no obvious evidence that pointed to a specific suspect. The woods, once so familiar, had become a place of secrets, their silence now oppressive in its weight. Vanessa's phone, which had lost signal at 2:11 p.m., was gone, as were her headphones. Her clothes, which had been burned or destroyed, seemed like deliberate attempts to erase any trace of her attacker. Yet, despite the best efforts of the investigators, there were no clear answers. Then came the breakthrough, the piece of evidence that had remained hidden in plain sight. As the team began to sift through every possible lead, a witness came forward with a detail that no one had considered: a dark-colored SUV. The witness recalled seeing the vehicle near the woods around the time Vanessa would have been jogging, its hood raised as if something was wrong. A man stood by the SUV, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses, his body tense, his attention focused on something, or someone, on his phone. The witness hadn't thought much of it at the time, but something about the scene had felt wrong. And when they later heard about Vanessa's disappearance, that moment had stuck in their mind. This seemingly small observation, an SUV, a man in the woods, an eerie feeling in the air, was about to change everything. Investigators began to follow the lead, tracing the vehicle's possible owners and cross-referencing it with people who had been in the area that afternoon. It didn't take long before a name emerged: Angelo Colon Ortiz. Ortiz, a private delivery driver, was known in the area, but he had no criminal record. On the surface, he seemed like a regular man. But now, with the SUV sighting, a connection began to form. Ortiz had been in the vicinity at the same time Vanessa had gone missing, and the description of the man in the SUV matched him. The investigators now had their first tangible lead. Ortiz was called in for questioning, and the team's hopes were high. They thought that with his cooperation, they could unravel the mystery of Vanessa's murder. At first, Ortiz was calm and collected. He denied any involvement, claiming he had been home all day. But there was something unsettling about his demeanor, something that didn't add up. His responses were vague, and when pressed further, his story began to crumble. He couldn't remember where he had been during certain periods. His timeline seemed inconsistent, and his nervous body language spoke volumes. His calm exterior was starting to crack. As the investigators dug deeper, they realized that the inconsistencies in his story were too many to ignore. The timeline was off, the details didn't line up, and Ortiz seemed increasingly defensive. But it wasn't until the forensic results came in that the case truly began to take shape. The case was about to shift from an investigation into a full-blown courtroom drama, with every argument, every motion, and every piece of evidence now under intense scrutiny. Despite the challenges ahead, the investigators couldn't afford to slow down. They needed to stay ahead of the defense. And to do that, they had to dig deeper into every detail, every lead, and every potential connection. They weren't just looking for the man responsible for Vanessa's death. They were searching for every scrap of evidence that could help build a stronger case. And then, as if the answers had been hiding just out of sight, one crucial detail surfaced that would turn the case on its head. The name Angelo Colon Ortiz had already been flagged due to the SUV sighting, but now, the pieces started to fall into place. Ortiz's car had been in the vicinity of Vanessa's last known location. and he had been seen around the time of her disappearance. But it wasn't just the SUV sighting that tied him to the case. The investigators learned that Ortiz, a private delivery driver, had been active in the area around that time. He was someone who would have had the opportunity to spot Vanessa, follow her, and potentially target her. His movements, though initially unremarkable, now seemed part of a larger, more sinister pattern. With Ortiz now squarely in the investigators' sights, the pressure to uncover more concrete evidence intensified. The breakthrough came when another witness came forward, someone who had seen Ortiz on the day of the murder, in a different light. This witness described a dark-colored SUV, matching the same description from earlier, and mentioned that it had been parked near the entrance to the woods. They didn't initially think much of it, but now, in light of the new information, they recalled a man standing next to the vehicle, acting strangely. He was fiddling with his phone, his attention distracted, his movements slow and deliberate. The witness hadn't recognized him at the time, but the more they thought about it, the more it seemed to fit the description of Ortiz. The investigators now had something more concrete to work with. Ortiz's movements, his vehicle, and his presence near the scene were no longer coincidences. They were patterns. It was clear that this was no random act, no spur-of-the-moment decision. Ortiz had been in the area at exactly the right time, and now, with the DNA evidence linking him directly to Vanessa, the case was rapidly becoming undeniable. As the investigation progressed, the pressure mounted on Ortiz. He had initially seemed calm and composed during questioning, but now, the cracks in his story were becoming more apparent. The defense, however, continued to fight tooth and nail, trying to discredit the evidence at every turn. But even as the legal battle raged on, the investigators were confident. They had the man responsible. They had the DNA. And now, they had his timeline, his presence at the scene, and his involvement in the crime. But just as they thought they were nearing the end of the road, a new twist in the case emerged, one that would shake the investigation to its core. It wasn't just the evidence they had already collected that would secure a conviction. The breakthrough wasn't just in the DNA, the SUV sightings, or even the witness testimonies. It was something much more subtle, a piece of evidence that had been hiding in plain sight, something small, something almost insignificant at first, but it would soon prove to be the key to unraveling the entire case. In the midst of the mounting pressure and the growing uncertainty, the investigators knew they were on the cusp of something big. They were about to uncover the one piece of evidence that would turn the tide in their favor, evidence that would lock Angelo Colon Ortiz into the crime and seal his fate. As they followed the leads, one clue after another, the investigation was about to take a turn they hadn't seen coming. And with it, the hope for justice, long delayed, was beginning to feel within reach. The investigation, which had been marked by frustrating dead ends and endless legal complications, finally seemed to gain momentum. With every passing day, the pressure mounted. Vanessa's family, already crushed by the loss of their daughter, had watched as the case dragged on, their hope for justice steadily waning. But even in the face of such uncertainty, the investigators were relentless. They knew they were close. They just needed that final piece to pull everything together. The breakthrough came when the forensic evidence, so painstakingly collected and analyzed, finally revealed its crucial truth. DNA samples recovered from under Vanessa's fingernails, the last trace of her desperate struggle, had been compared to Angelo Colon Ortiz's. The moment the results came back, there was no question. The DNA matched. It was irrefutable. Ortiz, who had seemed so calm during his questioning, was now connected to the crime in the most undeniable way. He had been there. He had touched her. He had killed her. The investigators now had the confirmation they had long suspected, but the reality of it still sent a shockwave through the team. The calm delivery driver who had been just another face in the town was now the central figure in a brutal murder. It was a gut-wrenching moment for everyone involved. The truth, which had been hidden in the shadows for so long, was now exposed. The nightmare that Vanessa's family had been living for months was now laid bare, and the man responsible for it was no longer a suspect. He was the killer. The moment the results came in, the sense of clarity was almost overwhelming. The investigators, who had worked tirelessly through the case's many twists and turns, felt a sense of validation, but there was no time for celebration. The legal battle was still far from over. Ortiz's defense team, determined to salvage what they could for their client, immediately went to work, trying to discredit the DNA evidence. They claimed that Ortiz hadn't fully understood his rights during the DNA collection process. They pointed to the fact that Ortiz had signed a consent form in a language that was not his first, arguing that he may not have understood what he was agreeing to. What followed was a long and drawn-out legal battle. Ortiz's defense team fought tirelessly to have the DNA evidence thrown out. They raised every possible legal objection, hoping to find any loophole that would lead to a mistrial. The case became as much about the technicalities of the law as it was about the truth. The defense tried to make the argument that the evidence was inadmissible due to procedural issues, but the prosecution held firm, determined to keep the case moving forward. Each day, the tension in the courtroom mounted. Ortiz's legal team fought to create doubt, while the prosecution worked to keep the focus squarely on the facts. The public, who had been following the case from the start, watched as the legal system was put to the test. The case, which had seemed so clear-cut, now hung in the balance as lawyers and legal experts debated over the smallest details. Vanessa's family, who had hoped that the truth would finally bring them some peace, were forced to relive their worst nightmare again and again. Each new legal twist felt like a gut punch, prolonging the agony they had already endured for so long. But despite the legal wrangling, one thing remained certain. The truth about Vanessa's death had been uncovered. Ortiz had been the one who had taken her life, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change that. The DNA evidence, despite the defense's attempts to discredit it, remained the strongest piece of proof against him. The breakthrough they had long awaited had finally come, and it could not be undone. And yet, even with the truth now in hand, the fight was far from over. As the case moved closer to a resolution, there were still questions that remained unanswered. What had driven Ortiz to commit such a heinous act? What was the motive behind the senseless violence that had ended Vanessa's life? The answers to these questions would come, but for now, all anyone could focus on was the undeniable truth. Vanessa's life had been stolen, and the man responsible was about to be held accountable. But justice would come at a price. It was clear that no matter how long the legal process stretched on, no amount of time or evidence could bring Vanessa back. No verdict would ever be enough to heal the pain that her family had endured. The hope for closure, for peace, now rested on the final steps of the trial, steps that would determine the future of the man who had taken everything from them. And as the investigation continued, one thing remained true. The fight for justice was not yet over. The trial of Angelo Colon Ortiz captured the attention of the nation. What began as a quiet, seemingly insignificant case in a small town had transformed into a public spectacle. Vanessa's murder was no longer just a tragedy for her family. It was a story that captivated the media and ignited intense debates across the country. People couldn't understand how a man who seemed so ordinary, so unremarkable, could commit such a heinous crime. Ortiz, a delivery driver with no criminal record, had turned into a symbol of the hidden evil that could lie within the most unlikely of people. As the trial began, the courtroom was packed. The press flooded in, eager for the latest updates, while the community of Princeton braced itself for what was to come. But for Vanessa's family, this was not a time for media attention or public scrutiny. It was a time to seek justice for their beloved daughter. They had already suffered the unimaginable loss, and now they were about to endure the painful process of reliving it in front of a room full of strangers. The emotional toll of the trial weighed heavily on them as they sat in the courtroom day after day, listening to the defense's arguments, hearing the details of their daughter's death over and over again. Ortiz's defense team came out swinging, determined to cast doubt on the DNA evidence that had so solidly linked their client to the crime. They argued that the forensic process had been flawed, claiming that Ortiz had not fully understood his rights when he consented to the DNA test. They questioned every detail, from the timing of the sample collection to the procedures followed in the lab. They pushed the idea that Ortiz's confession and the evidence against him was unreliable, aiming to create just enough uncertainty to sway the jury in their favor. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Each time the defense raised an objection, each time they called into question the integrity of the investigation, the room seemed to hold its breath. Vanessa's family sat through every agonizing moment, their hearts breaking as they heard the defense try to dehumanize their daughter as if the tragedy of her death could be diminished by legal games. The prosecution, on the other hand, fought back with an unwavering commitment to the truth. They reinforced the evidence, the witness testimony, and the hard facts that made Ortiz's guilt indisputable. The case was clear, but the defense was determined to make it anything but. The emotional weight of the trial was further amplified when Vanessa's mother, Rosanna, took the stand. Her voice trembled as she spoke about her daughter's life, about the woman Vanessa had been and the future she had lost. Rosanna was composed, but the pain in her eyes was evident. "I will never get to see her walk down the aisle," she said, her voice breaking. "I'll never see her become a mother. Those dreams, they were taken from me, from all of us." The courtroom fell silent as her words sank in. Every person in that room, even those who had never met Vanessa, felt the weight of the loss she had endured. Rosanna's words were not just about the injustice of her daughter's death. They were about the life Vanessa could have had, the moments that would never come, and the dreams that would never be realized. It was in this moment, as Vanessa's family spoke out in the face of such overwhelming pain, that the case took on a new depth. This wasn't just about legal proceedings. It was about the lives torn apart by a senseless act of violence. It was about a mother, a family, who would never be whole again. The trial had become more than a search for justice. It had become a painful reckoning with the irreversible consequences of one man's actions. But just as it seemed that the trial would stretch on indefinitely, there was a twist that no one saw coming. In a surprising move, after months of contentious courtroom drama, a plea deal was offered. The prosecution, weary from the battle and recognizing the strain it had placed on Vanessa's family, proposed a resolution that would bring an end to the trial. Ortiz would plead guilty to second-degree murder and robbery, sparing the family from having to endure a lengthy, drawn-out trial filled with more painful testimony. For Vanessa's family, the plea deal was bittersweet. It was not the justice they had envisioned, but it was justice nonetheless. They had been dragged through an emotional, exhausting process that had left them on edge, unsure of what the outcome would be. In the end, the plea deal spared them further trauma, but it also left them with a deep sense of sadness. No sentence could bring Vanessa back. No amount of legal victory could undo the pain they had experienced. Ortiz was sentenced to 45 years in prison, 20 years for robbery and 25 years for murder, with no possibility of parole for the murder charge. It was a long sentence, but it fell hollow. Nothing could replace the loss of a daughter, a sister, a friend. As the court proceedings wrapped up, Rosanna spoke once more, her voice weary but resolute. She thanked the prosecution for their efforts, but her grief was unmistakable. "Justice has been served," she said quietly, "but no sentence will ever bring her back. I'll never get to hold her again." The room was silent as the full weight of her words settled over everyone present. Vanessa's death had left an indelible mark on the hearts of those who loved her, and no legal outcome could ever erase the void she had left behind. The trial was over. The justice system had spoken. But for Vanessa's family, the journey had only just begun. No verdict, no amount of time behind bars, could ever bring them the peace they longed for. The hole left in their hearts would never heal. But they had fought for her. They had made sure her story was heard, and they would continue to honor her memory in whatever way they could. Because in the end, that was all they had left. After 6 long years of waiting, of enduring the emotional torment of an endless legal battle, the case of Vanessa Marcotte finally reached its conclusion. The courtroom, filled with tense anticipation, now waited for the final decision that would bring an end to the years of uncertainty, confusion, and heartache. And as the gavel was about to fall, the truth was no longer in question. The man who had taken Vanessa's life, who had torn apart a family and left a hole that would never be filled, was finally going to face the consequences of his actions. In a surprising turn, after all the legal battles, the endless debates over DNA evidence, and the emotional toll it had taken on her family, Angelo Colon Ortiz agreed to plead guilty. The plea deal would charge him with second-degree murder and robbery, a decision that left Vanessa's family, already weary from the years of waiting, with mixed emotions. It wasn't the closure they had hoped for, but it was a resolution, one that would finally bring an end to the courtroom drama and prevent further trauma for a family that had already suffered so much. The public's reaction to the plea deal was a mixture of relief, and frustration. For some, it was a sign that justice had been served, that the long, painful process was coming to an end. For others, it felt like an incomplete resolution. How could such a brutal crime be settled so easily? The reality was that no matter how long Ortiz was sentenced to prison, nothing could ever bring Vanessa back. The trial, the endless legal wrangling, had taken its toll, and now, finally, Vanessa's family could begin to move forward, though the weight of her absence would never leave them. Vanessa's mother, Rosanna, stood once again in the courtroom, her eyes filled with the deep sorrow of a mother who had lost her only daughter. In the face of all the legal proceedings, in the face of the injustice that had marred her life, she remained strong, but the pain was undeniable. As she spoke about the finality of the verdict, there was a quiet strength in her words, but the grief was still there. "The sentence won't bring her back," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Nothing can fix the hole in my heart, but at least now we know the truth. We know who did this to her." Ortiz was sentenced to 45 years in prison, 20 years for robbery, 25 years for the murder. There would be no chance of parole for the murder conviction. It was a long sentence, but it still felt so small compared to the life he had taken. No matter how long he spent behind bars, it could never undo what had been done. No amount of time could ever bring Vanessa back to the world she had been torn from so senselessly. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the judge delivered the sentence. It wasn't the dramatic, all-encompassing justice that many had hoped for. It wasn't the kind of punishment that could ever make sense of the crime, nor could it erase the grief Vanessa's family would carry with them for the rest of their lives. But it was the only justice the system could provide, and in the end, that was all they could ask for. Vanessa's family stood, their faces etched with the sorrow of years spent waiting for this moment. They knew it wasn't over. The pain would never go away. But at least now, the man who had stolen Vanessa's life had been held accountable. And for them, that was the best they could hope for. Vanessa's life had been full of promise, full of potential. She had been a bright light, full of dreams and ambitions. In an instant, that light had been snuffed out. The world had lost someone who could have changed it, and her family had lost someone who had meant everything to them. The pain of her loss would never fade, and no sentence could ever fix that. But as the trial came to a close, there was at least some small measure of justice, a moment where the world could finally say, Vanessa's story is not forgotten. Her life matters. As the courtroom emptied, Rosanna stood, looking down at the place where her daughter's murderer had once sat, her eyes filled with the deep, unshakable sorrow of a mother who had lost her child. But in that moment, there was also a quiet sense of finality, of a long, painful journey that had come to an end. And while justice had been served in a legal sense, Vanessa's family knew that the fight for their daughter's memory would continue for the rest of their lives. The wound would never heal, but at least now they could begin the process of moving forward, knowing that, despite everything, Vanessa's life had mattered. Vanessa's bright future, tragically, would never come to pass, but her memory, her spirit, and the love she gave to those who knew her would live on forever.
Vanessa embraced the spirit of giving back and volunteerism. To that end, the family has set up a website, VanessaMarcotte.org, so that you may learn more about Vanessa and the causes that were close to her heart.
The justice that had been delivered in court was only a small piece of the puzzle. Her family's love for her was the true legacy she had left behind. Vanessa's death serves as a stark reminder. Danger can lurk in the most ordinary places. It's a wake-up call for us all, a chilling reality that even in the safest, most peaceful corners of the world, evil can strike when we least expect it. Vanessa's story is not just about one tragic loss. It's a reminder that we must never let our guard down, because the threat can come from the most unlikely places, and sometimes it's already too late by the time we realize it. What do you think about this heartbreaking case? Was justice truly served? Could there have been more done to prevent this senseless loss? Let us know in the comments below. We want to hear your thoughts on this tragedy and whether you believe the sentence was fair. For more heart-wrenching true crime stories, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode. We dive deep into the stories that shape our world, revealing the hidden truths behind the headlines. And remember, sometimes the greatest danger is the one we least expect. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and keep questioning the world around you. Because justice, though it may be delayed, is always worth the fight.